From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Kamala Harris visits the border in Arizona as Bloomberg and Morning Consult's new battleground poll shows her leading Trump there and in other swing states, but lagging on the issue of immigration. We'll have more with Fernanda Bozmoski of the Atlantic Council. Plus, we'll be joined by David Hale, former U.S. ambassador to Lebanon, with Israel today saying it struck Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut in what Iran is calling a dangerous escalation of hostilities. This as Iranian operatives are indicted by the Department of Justice and sanctioned by the Treasury Department for attempting to influence the U.S. election. We'll look at election security concerns with Benjamin Hovland, chair of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, this hour. And joining me for these conversations for the duration here on Balance of Power, Bloomberg's Laura Davison. Laura, great to have you. Happy Friday. It's been a wild week once again in American politics, and it's not over yet with Kamala Harris on the border this evening. Yes,
she'll be there. Trump will also be talking to auto workers in Michigan. And at the White House, Joe Biden is very much thinking about what's happening in Lebanon, the attack Israel on this Hezbollah headquarters. This is something he wanted to wrap up to sort of solidify his legacy on the issue. Things are really trending in the wrong direction there.
Yeah, never forget in his Oval Office address explaining his decision to not seek re-election, he said one of the things he wants to achieve is peace in the Middle East, and it does seem that is getting farther away rather than closer. Of course, he is no longer running. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are, and we have new polling that sheds light on the state of the race. Bloomberg's Gregory Korte is joining us now with more. So, Gregory, obviously this is our swing state poll done with Morning Consult, and while it shows that across the 7 states that matter the most in this election, Harris is leading by 3 points. We're within the margin of error here. What is outside the margin of error is the lead Donald Trump still has on the issue of immigration.
Yeah, this is obviously one of his stronger issues. And what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, though, is Vice President Harris really leaning into the issues that Trump is strongest on the economy, on immigration, even going after him on taxes, on housing, on all inflation, all of the things that the former president has been campaigning on. She's not afraid to go there with not just campaign stops outlining, what she's going to do on different issues in these swing states, but really bombarding them with millions of dollars worth of ads.
She's cut into that lead that Trump has had on the trust on the economy. Is she able to do that on immigration, or is Trump just too far ahead and then has really owned that issue?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But what we've seen in the border crossing data from Customs and Border Patrol is that the border crossings, the border encounters of the southwest border that they're able to count, it's a crude measurement, but they are at the lowest point since the early months of the Biden presidency. So it's an issue that's kind of come off the front pages a little bit. It's come off of the nightly cable TV news shows. It doesn't have quite the energy that it used to have, but it's resurfacing in the presidential debate in terms of Haitian immigrants. Those are legal residents. They get temporary protective status. It's technically a different issue, but Trump is trying to obviously bring all of these under the umbrella of this threat that he sees from people coming in from the United States. This is only Harris's second trip to the border during the presidency. She was supposed to be able to try to work on the root causes of this, which have come down. It is somewhat seasonal, but yeah, this is an issue that she's going to have to kind of figure out how she can't be as tough as Trump is on the border. She's going to have to figure out a more nuanced way to talk about it.
Yeah, so as not to alienate some members of her party on this issue as well. To Laura's point on the ground she's been able to gain on the economy, we actually in this poll looked specifically at some of the policy proposals both candidates have put forward. And it's striking that most of the popular ones are actually Harris proposals when it relates to things for the middle class and housing.
Yeah, the single most popular one, I should say, is the former President Trump's proposal to end taxes on Social Security benefits. 8 in 10 voters like it, 9 in 10 senior voters like it for obvious reasons, right? And then there's his proposals to end taxes on overtime, also popular. But yeah, housing affordability is a big issue. So her proposal to do something about that. But also the biggest thing for her is this grocery price gouging issue. She's been very vague on how her attempts to go after grocery store chains that jack up prices, how exactly is that going to work? But it still resonates with swing state voters quite a bit. They've seen their grocery bills go up 20% or more over the past 4 years. Everybody's seen the sticker shock, and just the fact that she's talking about it, I think, has closed the gap. She's. If we look at that question again on who do you trust more on these issues, she's gaining ground against Trump on the issue of inflation.
All right, Bloomberg's Gregory Korte, thank you so much. Now, we also have an eye this evening on New York City as Mayor Eric Adams pleads not guilty to federal corruption charges in a Manhattan courtroom today. Here's his lawyer, Alex Spiro, following the proceedings.
The mayor entered a plea of not guilty. He's innocent. Second thing that happened in court today is that we let the court know that next week we'll be filing a motion to dismiss. We expect these charges to be dismissed.
This comes as more New York Democrats join the call for him to resign. Congressman Jerry Nadler today saying that while he deserves due process, Adams has, quote, lost the ability to effectively lead the city of New York. End quote. Let's turn now to Kate Ackley of Bloomberg Government. And Kate, that really speaks to this idea that this isn't just about Eric Adams. It's about what Eric Adams being indicted could do to the electoral chances of other Democrats in New York, a state that could help ultimately decide the balance of power in the House of Representatives.
Right. There are some pivotal races for House control in New York, and some are near New York City. So this can be an issue. I've talked to some Republican operatives just today asking, is this going to be something that you message on? Is this going to show up in ads? And, they say that it will, that this is something that they can showcase. They'll have, pictures or videos of, the Democrats being with Mayor Adams, trying to just associate them, and also with Governor Kathy Hochul as well, who is not under indictment, but has low poll ratings there, and trying to tie Democrats to some of these issues of corruption or just lack of favorability.
What kind of pressure does this put on prominent Democrats like Kathy Hochul, like Chuck Schumer, like Hakeem Jeffries to, weigh in, get involved here and, potentially, call for an ouster of one of their own?
Well, certainly for Jeffries, who's looking at trying to get the majority in the House, I think that's going to be the top perspective, the main lens through which he views this. And if he does see that could hurt, that having Adams stay there in office can hurt the Democratic Party's chances of taking the House, winning some of those battleground House seats in the state of New York. I think we'll hear that. That'll be the number one sort of prism that he'll use.
So that's one thing that happened in New York today was the arraignment of Adams. Another thing that happened was a meeting this morning between Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy at Trump Tower. Here's part of what Trump said to reporters about the war and his connections to Zelenskiy and Vladimir Putin.
We have a very good relationship. And I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. And I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly.
Laura, of course, this meeting with them today follows a bit of a public spat between the two that's played out over the course of the last week, with each criticizing the other. Yeah.
So Kate, this has been a very public week of these insults. What does this mean for Zelenskiy if Trump wins and he has this relationship that goes sour with him?
Well, you've seen him basically, both of them tried to make nice today. This was, an in-person meeting, one of the first in a long time. So both of them making overtures, trying to look like they're, willing to talk, literally willing to talk. So I think that speaks for itself.
But it's also worth noting Republicans have also expressed some anger with Zelenskiy for going with Governor Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania to a munitions plant. They say that was political, something may be done in favor of Harris. And it does raise the question if more supplemental funding is needed in the future, if it's going to be even more difficult than it already was to get that funding approved in Congress, no matter who's in the White House.
Yes. And when Zelenskiy was on the Hill this week, it was after Congress had sort of wrapped up its necessary business of funding the government beyond the end of this month. There were several members of Congress that did not meet with him. Some said it was scheduling. You know, it wasn't necessarily that they were snubbing him, but definitely his, relationships on Capitol Hill, his relationships with the two potential next presidents are of serious, will have serious implications in the new year.
All right, Bloomberg Government's Kate Ackley, thank you so much for joining us. Now coming up, Israel strikes Hezbollah deep inside Beirut, attacking what they say is the organization's headquarters in an attempt to target Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. We'll speak to former U.S. ambassador to Lebanon, David Hale, for more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Moments ago, the Israel Defense Forces carried out a precise strike on the central headquarters of the Hezbollah terror organization that served as the epicenter of Hezbollah's terror. Hezbollah's central headquarters was intentionally built under residential buildings in the heart of the Dahia in Beirut.
That was Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson Daniel Hagari announcing today's strikes in the city of Beirut. Israel says it was targeting Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah with the operation, a ratcheting up of hostilities in Lebanon with the Iranian proxy. Israel is now saying it's examining the results of its airstrikes on Hezbollah's headquarters and will be hitting strategic Hezbollah targets in the coming hours. So for more, we're joined now by David Hale. He is global fellow at the Wilson Center and also served as U.S. ambassador to Lebanon during the Obama administration. Ambassador, thank you very much for being here with us on Balance of Power. So Israel has said it was targeting Nasrallah with these strikes. To what extent should we expect the retaliation Hezbollah could deliver in response will be different in nature, depending on whether or not Israel was actually successful in taking out the leader?
Well, this is a momentous event, of course. Hezbollah is the A-team of terrorism and has been for decades, and Nasrallah is really an extraordinary force behind that terrorism. We don't know, of course, what's happened, and we don't know what Hezbollah's response will be. But what's notable is that they have been on the back foot now in response to Israeli operations for 2 weeks. There's been, of course, this series of attacks on their command and control structure, culminating in this attack. And I think it'll be very hard for Hezbollah to determine what kind of response to take. They have not wanted to escalate beyond where they are. They'd like to control the escalatory ladder, but now Israel is in charge of that. And I think Hezbollah will be at odds and ends trying to sort out what to do next.
Ambassador, what do we know about Hezbollah's ability to respond right now, given this attack?
Well, they have accumulated massive amounts of missiles and drones and other sophisticated equipment that goes well beyond what we saw in the last war, major war in 2006, as have the Israelis. But they have only used it up to a point because there has been, I think, a desire to try to maintain, as I said, their hand on the spigot of violence. And I don't think that they determine it to be in their interest to escalate too far because they know what the Israelis can do, as we have seen. Without their very charismatic leader, the tried and true and experienced Nasrallah, I think it'll be very hard to see what they're going to do. It's an organization with a deep-seated bench and a strong rank and file, but they are going to be, I think, at a very difficult spot now, and I think will have a hard time figuring out what to do. And so I think the Israelis, in turn, will continue to keep the pressure on and continue to escalate.
Well, it's one thing for the Israelis to have a difficult time guessing what Hezbollah is going to do. It might be another thing entirely, sir, for the U.S. to guess what Israel is going to do, because the Pentagon said today the U.S. was not told in advance that Israel was going to be conducting this operation. That's something I spoke about on the earlier edition of Balance of Power with Hagar Shamali, formerly of the National Security Council. And this is what she told me, and then I'll ask you a question.
If you look at similar assaults like this or attacks in Israel's history, they don't always give the U.S. a heads up when they've been targeting terrorist commanders and so on, things like that. They don't often, because these are very sensitive operations. Often they have to verify for sure that their target is in fact there. And then sometimes those decisions are made within minutes. Sometimes they take longer, but often minutes. But also on the U.S. side, they're worried for a leak. And if a leak happens, that target moves and they lose the opportunity the way they see it.
So, Ambassador, even if there is historic precedent for not informing the U.S. of all operational decisions Israel is making, considering this strike happened as the U.S. is actively, publicly pushing for Israel to come to a near-term ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah of about 3 weeks, what does that say about the Israeli government's consideration for the U.S.'s thoughts on this conflict?
Right. I mean, it's true. In fact, most American presidents don't really want to be asked because they don't want to be put in the position of having to say yes or no. But what I think, to your question, the bigger story here is that the United States has had difficulty establishing relevance over the last year in having its will respected by either Israel on the one hand or the other adversaries on the other hand, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran. And they've offered a series of diplomatic approaches that have not really been taken seriously by anybody because they don't meet the needs of the moment. They're based on old realities rather than the new realities of the Middle East since October 7th, which starts with a never again mentality in Israel. So unless the United States can offer a diplomatic approach that offers real, tangible, new security and stability and deterrence on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, Israel will continue to do what it feels it has to do on its own. And in fact, the truth is they are for the first time finally reestablishing deterrence through these kinds of attacks on the command and control structure of Hezbollah.
Ambassador, you bring up an important date, October 7th, and the one-year anniversary of that is coming up in just a little bit over a week. How does the significance of that date weigh on both Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel as they're all deciding what to do next?
Well, I think for Hezbollah, this entire conflict was a gratuitous war of choice, a voluntary war to join based on Iran's interests rather than any Lebanese interest in piling on to Israel. I also think it was just a matter of time that once the Israelis had felt that they completed more or less their operations in Gaza, so now it's more of a stability-based operation in and out, they've more or less done what they can do militarily, that they would turn their attention to the north and the unfinished business that was presented by Hezbollah. And I go back to that never again mentality, that threshold moment of October 7th. Netanyahu and his coalition have to decide whether and when to send 60,000 Israeli civilians back to the northern border area. And they're not going to do that unless they're absolutely confident that there aren't going to be attacks the next days or weeks or months from the north.
Well, Ambassador, you just suggested something interesting, which is in your view that Israel seems to be signaling it is mostly finished with its operations in Gaza, and yet Israel will not agree to a ceasefire there, despite the presence still of the remaining hostages being held by Hamas. If they are mostly done with that fight, moving on to this different front, why not just accept the ceasefire that Hezbollah says, if you stop the fighting in Gaza, will stop targeting Israel's north?
Well, what I meant to say really is that the heavy thrust of the military operations in Gaza have more or less done whatever it is it can do. And I think Israel wants to maintain, doesn't need a ceasefire because of that fact, and wants to maintain a free hand operationally because there are still hostages being held, and they are going to need to continue to go in and out because the area will be very insecure for quite some time in the absence of any kind of governance structure or reconstruction infrastructure. We haven't seen anything developed along those lines. So they still want a free hand in the south. I'm just saying that they now have and the Israeli leadership themselves have said this, Defense Minister Gallant, the focus of attention has shifted now to the north.
The risk of escalation has always been the question that's been behind every single development in the Middle East over the past year or so. What is the risk right now that that this really does escalate quickly? You know, Iran gets directly involved, or perhaps the U.S. sees a need?
I think the Iranians would be very reluctant to get directly involved. The last time they got directly involved was after their commanders were killed in Damascus, and it didn't go very well. The Israelis and their neighbors and the United States prevented the missiles and drones from entering into Israel. So I don't foreclose that completely, but I don't see it as very likely. I think what we will see, by the way, is the potential for terrorist attacks anywhere in the world in weeks and months to come. That is Hezbollah's specialty. You'll also see sectarian violence potentially, at least tension in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shia Muslim group. The country is divided amongst many different communities, including Sunni Muslims and Christian Muslims. So a primary focus of Lebanese leaders will be trying to absorb that and limit the spillover of that. But instead, I think really the escalatory decision-making here continues to rest with the Israelis. Are they going to continue to press their advantages now, or do they think this is enough?
All right, well, we'll all soon find out, I'm sure. Former U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon, David Hale, now Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for joining us. Now coming up, Bloomberg's exclusive doorstep interview with Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang. We'll have part of that conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg News reporting this evening that Chinese regulators are discouraging local companies from purchasing some of Nvidia's chips. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has more. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kaylee, I had the chance to catch up with Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang today while he was in Washington. I spoke with him right before Bloomberg News reported that Beijing is stepping up pressure on Chinese companies to buy locally produced artificial intelligence chips instead of Nvidia products. This is part of China's bid to counter U.S. sanctions. I asked Huang if he felt U.S. restrictions were effective, and he told me it's a balancing act.
We have to defer all of the policy making to the administration. They understand that the balancing national security versus the prosperity of American technology all over the world. We're exporting American technology, which is really terrific for the United States. That the world is built on Nvidia, on American standards. Nvidia is an American company, and our government and the administration would love to see us succeed. And so finding the right balance is very difficult to do, but they're doing a wonderful job.
The U.S. banned Nvidia from selling its most advanced AI processors to Chinese companies in 2022, but Nvidia has modified some versions of its chips so they can be sold and comply to U.S. regulations. Nvidia stock has nearly doubled this year due to a boom in artificial intelligence. To support the growing industry, executives like Huang say the U.S. needs to invest more heavily in expanding energy infrastructure for the sector. Just last week, Microsoft signed a deal with Constellation Energy to use nuclear power to support the company's AI energy needs. I asked Huang if he felt nuclear is the way forward.
Nuclear is a wonderful way forward as one of the sources of energy, one of the sources of sustainable energy. It won't be the only one. We're going to need energy from all sources and balance the availability and the cost of energy as well as the sustainability over time.
Now, I did ask Huang if he's been in touch with either of the presidential candidates as AI becomes a topic on the campaign trail. He told me he hasn't, but that he trusts whoever wins the White House will do the best thing for the U.S. Kaylee?
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, great reporting and great get of Jensen Huang. Thank you so much. Now, coming up, of course, the U.S. election is fast approaching and voters are already voting. They could be facing a whole new campaign of disinformation. We're talking about those threats next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We see our foreign adversaries trying to put into their malign influence campaigns disinformation and misinformation about the vulnerability of our voting systems. Our voting systems are quite resilient and they are quite diffuse, and they are by and large not connected, and almost a majority not connected to the internet. My colleagues at CISA over at DHS have the lead for the federal government in working to protect our critical infrastructure, and importantly, working with state and local officials to protect that infrastructure, that voting infrastructure. Remember, the voting in this country is controlled, owned, operated, and administered all at the state and local level. So our job in the federal government, working across the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, is to assist our state and local partners in that effort. We are sharing information about efforts to influence those that electoral process, but the election systems and the infrastructure themselves are very diffuse and very diffuse across the state and local jurisdictions and not connected to the internet. So people should be on the lookout for misinformation about that.
That was Deputy U.S. Attorney General Lisa Monaco speaking with me on the early edition of Balance of Power exclusively about the threat of mis- and disinformation in the upcoming election. And joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio for more is Benjamin Hovland. He is commissioner of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. So this is a topic he, I'm sure, spends a lot of time thinking about. He's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Thank you so much for your time, sir. This is especially important to consider as early voting in some states is already underway. Are you seeing any signs of evidence of mis and disinformation about, frankly, the soundness of early voting systems in particular impacting behavior?
Well, thanks, Kaylee, and thanks for having me. It's great to be back. I think that Lisa Monaco's statements around mis and disinformation is absolutely right and absolutely a concern. We had a hearing at the Election Assistance Commission yesterday where we heard from representatives from the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, CISA, and one of those things that is consistent that we have been hearing and the intelligence community has been putting out is about foreign malign influence that's, nation-state adversaries trying to sow division amongst Americans, putting bad information out there. And it's why we always talk about the need to go to your state or local election official for that trusted source information. Elections and how they're run in this country, it's at the local level. It varies across the country. And so that local election official, that state official in your community is the best place to get trusted source information.
Commissioner, what does this misinformation and disinformation look like? If people see something online on social media that looks like it might be a little sketchy, what are sort of the red flags there that are tells that this is potentially problematic information?
Thanks for that, Laura. Well, one thing is, if it sounds too good to be true, if it sounds pretty outrageous, certainly that is an indicator. We see all range of things about elections, but at the end of the day, again, going to that trusted source, going to your state or local election official is the best place to go. You can always go to eac.gov we have information about a whole range of things regarding voting, but again, when you're thinking about the process, the best place to go is there. And, at this point, I certainly think as well, voter registration deadlines are coming up just basically next week. The first registration deadlines are 30 days from the election. And so people going to vote.gov, making sure they're registered, making sure they can participate, that's really the first step.
Well, on the idea of voter registration, we got news today from North Carolina removing 747,000 people from voter rolls, in part because of reasons like they changed address without notification or maybe moved out of the state. Do those people know automatically that they've been removed from the voter rolls, or is that something you need to go proactively check? I just wonder how this could ultimately influence turnout in a critical state like North Carolina.
That is a great question, and one where there's often a lot of confusion. We sometimes hear about purges, and certainly there have been instances of that historically, but there's also something that is statutorily mandated. List maintenance is what we call it. But again, Americans move every day. Americans turn 18 every day. Unfortunately, Americans die every day. And one of the important roles of election officials as a safeguard, as a safety measure, is to constantly be working those voter rolls to ensure they're up to date, ensure that they're as accurate as possible. And part of that is taking people off the rolls who have moved. And so, again, from all I've seen in the North Carolina situation, that is what's there. Again, following the law, making sure that they're up to date. But again, if anyone's concerned about that, they can always go to vote.gov. Voter registration deadlines, like I said, are coming up. And so it's just always a great idea to make sure you're registered, make sure your registration is up to date at a current address. That makes it easier for you when you go to the polling place. It makes it easier for the poll workers. And certainly that's the best way to be ready and then make that plan to vote ultimately.
There's a lot of polling that say that people are very concerned about violence surrounding this election. What are the top threats you're tracking in terms of what could be a threat to in-person voting on Election Day?
We've certainly heard a lot of that. One of the things that I've seen traveling across the country and working with election officials is the amount of effort that's gone into collaborating and coordinating with local law enforcement, making those plans, again, thinking through different scenarios. But at the end of the day, the key part is that Americans are able to make their voices heard. And so election officials have plans and contingency plans in place. And at the end of the day, they're very hopeful that Americans will come out and make their voices heard, whether that's a mail or absentee ballot, whether that's early in-person voting or on Election Day. Your vote counts the same no matter what, and it's really thinking about what makes the most sense for you, and then ultimately making the plan to vote and making your voice heard.
With that, so I get two questions about the election. One, who's going to win? Nobody knows. But two, when are we going to find out? And that seems to be really uncertain. What is it, when could we expect to start to hear who might have won the presidential election?
Well, election night results are always unofficial. And so then what we find out will probably depend on how close the election is. All signs point to this being a close election. And when we think about why those election night results are unofficial, that is because election officials are processing those ballots. There are safeguards in place. And if it's really close, you might be getting down to things like provisional ballots or those ballots in states where they're not allowed to start processing mail ballots ahead of time, or they have a postmark standard where if somebody gets it in the mail by Election Day. And so each of those state laws will vary how long it takes to count the ballots, and then depending how close it is will tell us how long we know. But the one thing we know for sure is that election night results are unofficial.
All right, Benjamin Hovland, Commissioner of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, thank you so much for your time. Now, still ahead, Vice President Harris makes a trip to the border in Arizona. We'll have more on her visit and the issue of immigration with Fernanda Bozmoski of the Atlantic Council. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What Kamala Harris is trying to do today is to go on the offense against Donald Trump and highlight the fact that he helped kill a bipartisan immigration bill in Congress this year. It's incumbent on her to try to raise that to voters. I don't know how trusted she is on that issue right now, just given the posture voters have towards the Democratic Party. But, addressing the issue, taking it head on, is something that could break through and help her with some of these remaining undecided voters.
Eli Oakley, Morning Consult U.S. politics analyst, on the earlier edition of Balance of Power, highlighting our latest Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll, which finds former President Trump leading Harris on the issue of immigration by 14 percentage points among likely voters in the 7 key battleground states we're watching. This comes, of course, as Vice President Harris is in one of them, Arizona, visiting the border today. For more, we're joined here on Bloomberg TV and radio by Fernanda Bozmoski, Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsh Latin America Center. Thank you so much for being with us, Maria. We are seeing Harris try to strike up a harsher tone on the issue of the border specifically, talk about her credentials as a prosecutor. At the same time, she also is giving at least some lip service to the notion of creating more legal pathways to immigration. How hard is it to walk that fine line for a Democratic candidate?
We're seeing presidential candidate Harris address the big elephant in the room. I think immigration has always been a top issue for voters, and the election is just a month and a day away. Sorry, it's a few weeks away. And so it makes sense. It makes sense for her to go to be proactive, tackle the issue head on, and propose some ideas. I think going beyond the rhetoric, Democrats and Republicans, policy-wise, I think we've seen some convergence post-pandemic. Post-COVID, when Title 42 entered into force, when the border was closed for a few days, we're now seeing more and more similarities. And I think that this message that we want to fix the immigration system, that it's broken, is something that anybody, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, can agree on.
What are some of the policy specifics that you're hoping to hear from Harris? What are the kinds of messages that resonate with voters?
Well, she's in Arizona, where former President Trump is ahead of her, I think, by 3 points. So expect a harsher tone, perhaps not as harsh as when she was in Guatemala back in 2021 and was blatantly telling migrants do not come to the United States. But we'll see her be tougher and have a stance on that the border must be secured that we haven't heard so far. Since 2021, she's been really focused on addressing the root causes of migration, and I think that she will tone that down a little bit, focus more on the domestic issues. But yeah, I think that we're going to see the rhetoric heat up in the last weeks of the campaign.
Well, as you allude back to her visit to Guatemala, Maria, it is putting focus on the notion that she was part of this administration put in charge of focusing on the root causes of migration over the U.S. border. Where does that whole root causes conversation, the situation in these countries from which people are fleeing, have here? Is there a role for it, or are we just not in that moment in American politics where that's a message that is received?
I think immigration right now is going to be really a domestic issue. There's no appetite to hear about how taxpayer dollars could help alleviate some of the conditions in these countries that are pushing people away. When we think about immigration and people coming to the United States to seek asylum or to reunify with family members, we don't necessarily care that they're corrupt countries, that there's violence, that there's a lack of economic opportunities. And those issues aren't issues that will be resolved within a presidential term. Those are issues that will take years, if not decades, or generations to be improved. So it's really not a winning strategy, I would say, to really go back to the root causes conversation, because those are just lingering issues in these countries.
We saw a bipartisan immigration bill come together earlier this year in Congress and then quickly fall apart after Trump said he wanted to have this as a live election issue. What do you think the chances are, and what could potentially be a divided Washington next year for a bill like this, not solving the root issues, but at least taking a first pass at an issue that Washington hasn't been able to address?
I have my hesitations and doubts if we'll get that close to putting a bipartisan bill back on the floor anytime soon. I think in a way that could have been a blueprint for going forward. I do think that the proposals and the conversation that was started back in February is kind of the foundation on which conversations can be and should be focused on going forward. The bill had not only policy proposals that could help to alleviate some of the pressure that the border has been experiencing over the last years, but there were also some very operational things within the bill, including just going back to basics like revising the budgets and resource allocation for more border agents, patrol agents.
Well, we know budgeting and funding issues aren't always the easiest to resolve on Capitol Hill. Maria Fernanda Bozmoski, thank you so much for joining us. And we want to get more on this now with our political panel. Rick Davis is with us, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, our signature political panel here on this Friday. Rick, of course, you know the state of Arizona incredibly well. That is where Harris is spending her evening today, making a visit to the border. Optically, this is something that we haven't seen her do very much. Is now too late to do it for it to actually make a difference in how voters perceive her on this issue?
I would say, just as it relates to the last interview, I think there has always been quite a bit of bipartisan agreement on tackling immigration reform. John McCain's bill in 2013 got 68 votes. 68 votes. We just passed a Senate reform bill that couldn't make it through the House because of politics. So there's this fancy dance between getting policy done and the political ramifications of that policy. And I think this year just ran out of time and got into the politics of the presidential race. But, I think that Kamala Harris should have spent more time throughout the course of her term in office, on border issues. If she had any ambition at all politically for a future, she knew she was going to have to tackle that issue. I think it's good, as Eli Yoakley said earlier, that, she's doing it now and taking it to Trump on this bill, but otherwise, may be too little too late.
Jeannie, Harris only has another, month or so on the campaign trail to try to win over voters, knowing that the immigration where she's weaker and the economy where she's been gaining strength are the two issues that voters care most about. How does she divide up her time?
I think the economy's got to take precedence because it is the most important issue on the minds of the most voters, particularly undecideds. That said, I think she has really got to do what she's doing today, which is go on the attack, prosecute the case against Donald Trump on this border issue. Just one example, policy-wise, what is he saying? This man is talking about mass deportation. That is his answer. He talks about it with glee. He talks about it very proudly. His own vice presidential running mate came out and said, who would trust this government to do this? So this is the kind of argument she's got to make. She's got to end run around him. No conservative worth their salt, is going to want big government coming out and deporting people. Even Donald Trump said, we're going to deport people and we'll accidentally scoop up a woman, and that's all the media will talk about because it will be a mother who didn't do anything wrong. That's what he's talking about policy-wise. She's got to prosecute him on that and on his killing that bill, and she's got to say she will do these things if she's elected president.
Well, and I'm sure these issues might come up in the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz that comes up on Tuesday. Rick, when J.D. Vance has been talking about immigration through the lens of people eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, do they actually risk losing points on an issue they are winning on because of focus on stories like that?
Yeah, I totally agree. This has always been part of what Donald Trump himself liked to do, is find the most heinous crimes committed by an immigrant and use that as a rationale for his policies on the border. It's just overselling. The reality is the American public overwhelmingly believe we have a crisis at the border that has not been addressed by the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. And almost by fault, they give Republicans a chance to do something about it. So I think that clearly Vance will be a little bit on the defensive as after the very awkward admission that, he's basically making it up about what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, and no doubt that'll come up early in the debate. So I think that Republicans haven't been doing themselves any favors by just overselling, the reaction to the border. It's just the hyperventilation about it is actually working to the Democrats' benefit.
All right, Rick and Jeannie are going to stay with us. It's coming up. We look at the political fallout of the criminal indictment of New York City Mayor Eric Adams. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. New York City Mayor Eric Adams pleaded not guilty to federal corruption charges in court today in the face of growing calls for his resignation. Back with us now, our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Jeannie, of course, is in New York, where all of this is going down. We've heard from a number of members of Congress, Jeannie, calling for him to resign. Not yet, though, from Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. How long do you think that'll take?
I don't think we know yet. I have to say it was surreal to see him sitting in court, listening to these charges against him, pleading innocent. Such a sad time for New Yorkers. And of course, we haven't heard from Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries yet. And Kathy Hochul, some people read her statement today as maybe like a Nancy Pelosi to Joe Biden. You're gonna, you better make up your mind the way I want you to, or I'm going to pull the plug. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think Hochul is hearing from certainly behind the scenes from Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. And I think if he's going to go, they're going to have to pull the plug on him because I don't think he is incentivized to leave on his own at this point.
Rick, there are a couple other prominent New Yorkers who have really dug in the face of legal conflict. George Santos, Donald Trump. Is this potentially just a new strategy going forward?
Yeah, I would have not thought that you would have been out the minute something like this. You get indicted, you're supposed to leave office, make way for the debate to keep going. And you do have a lot of hot congressional races in New York that this is a huge distraction from. I'm a little bit torn as to whether resigning actually resolves that and whether or not this is just going to be a problem for Democrats, in the next 40 days leading up to the election. But I think Jeannie's right. I think that it's actually not up to him. In this case, Kathy Hochul can actually fire him. And so I would anticipate a call getting made saying, by the end of the week, you're gone one way or another. You better find a way to resign. So I think that's the easiest way for Democrats to resolve this and move on and focus on these congressional races where they will not take back the House of Representatives without winning the majority of these races that are up for grabs in New York.
Yep, the path runs through that state. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you so much. And a big thanks to Bloomberg's Laura Davison for joining me for the hour. It's incredible to consider we're having this conversation about New York politics as we all get ready to descend on New York, or at least the campaigns do, for the vice presidential debate there next Tuesday.
It's really, really incredible. It's only 37 days away.
37 days. It feels like a lifetime and no time at all. We'll, of course, continue to have it covered for you here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.